Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series for international economics. And in this particular video lecture, I'm going to be taking a look at a one-factor economy, and in particular, going to be taking a look at comparative advantage and to try and give people a good understanding of the role of comparative advantage and how it impacts international trade patterns. So for simplifying purposes, we're just going to assume that we're looking at one economy, and we're going to refer to this as the home economy. That there's only one factor of production, which is labor. We don't have any capital that we're going to be having to deal with. So we're looking at this at a very simplified level, and that labor is the only input that is being used in the production process, and that we're only producing two goods, to simplify it. Realize that I have beer and pizza here. Your book references wine and cheese. I'm not a big fan of wine and cheese, so I prefer beer and pizza. So I use beer and pizza as examples anytime I do this type of video. So realize that when we say that labor productivity is what we're going to be taking a look at in both industries. In particular, the time it takes to produce 1 unit of beer and the time it takes to produce a pizza. So a unit labor requirement, as it has up here in the title box, is the hours of labor needed to produce 1 unit of that output. So in our example, it's going to take 4 hours to produce a case of beer, and it's going to take 1 hour to produce a pizza. And that the unit labor requirement, I'm going to try to use the same notations that your textbook uses. So the A is a unit labor requirement. So we have the unit labor requirement of beer. So you have LB is 4 hours for a case, and LP, the subscript for the labor for pizza, is going to equal 1 hour. So it takes 4 hours to produce a case of beer and 1 hour to produce a pizza. Realize and remember what the production possibilities frontier is. I refer to it as the PPF. Your book refers to it as the PF. So just make sure you realize that I use slightly different notation for this with respect to your textbook. So the PPF is going to illustrate all the levels of production of the two goods that are possible to achieve. Notice that what it's saying is that it's quote unquote possible to achieve. We're not saying anything about what is going to be produced, but what can be produced. And we'll introduce a little extra complexity in determining how much of the two goods are actually going to be produced in this one economy, this home economy that we're talking about. Realize that it also gives us a good illustration of the concept of a trade-off, i.e. that if you're engaging in one activity more, by default, you have to engage in another activity at a lower level. So that's what I mean by a trade-off. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to assume that there are 400 hours of labor available, and that we're going to keep the unit labor requirement of beer at 4 hours a case. And again, the unit labor requirement of pizza is equal to 1 hour for pizza. So these assumptions haven't changed from the previous slides. The only thing I've introduced is I've told you how many hours are available in this economy for people to work. So the amount of hours of labor that is available is equal to 400. So if we take a look at this, if I know that I have 400 hours of labor, and it takes 4 hours to produce a case of beer, if I take the amount of labor I have and divide by the unit labor requirement for that commodity here, beer, I end up with 100 cases of beer. And what that tells me is if I don't produce any pizza, use all of my labor to produce beer, I am going to be able to produce 100 cases of beer. So make sure you realize that if you take the amount of labor available, divide by the unit labor requirement for that particular commodity, and that will give you the maximum amount that can be produced. In our case, 100 cases of beer. We could do the same thing for pizza. We take the amount of labor available, 400. We divide by the unit labor requirement for pizza 1, and that gives us 400 pizzas. And if we connect those 2 points together, that will give us our PPF. All the points on the PPF are possible. That's why it's called the production possibilities frontier. So the economy can produce, for example, using all of its resources to produce beer, 100 cases of beer, and no pizza. On the other extreme, it can produce 400 pizzas and no beer. And then all the combinations on the PPF that connect those points are also possible. So everything on the PPF is possible. And if you're on the PPF, you're using all the labor that's available to you. I believe in your text there was an actual figure or a formula in your book, 3/1, which shows that the amount of labor used in one commodity plus the other is less than or equal to the total labor that's available. The less than is just saying that there's a possibility that there's some level of unemployment, that some labor resources aren't being utilized, and we could actually be inside of the PPF because of this underutilization of resources, i.e. labor, i.e. unemployment. So let's take a look at if we are at point A and we desire to move from point A to point B. What occurs is that you realize there's going to be a trade-off. In order to produce more pizza, we have to shift resources, labor, away from beer production over to pizza production. So in order to increase the amount of pizza being produced, we reallocate resources away from beer, and that causes the production of beer to decrease, and those resources get shifted over to pizza, which allows us to increase the level of pizza production. So this is what is meant when economists talk about a trade-off, the fact that if you engage in this activity, i.e. producing more of pizza, by default you have to produce less beer in order to accomplish that. And remember that the slope of the PPF is the opportunity cost. It tells us that if we gain more of one item, how much we have to give up in order to achieve that. If we want to physically calculate what the slope looks like, we can start at this point here, this extreme end of producing nothing but beer, and then move to the point where we're only producing pizza. So if we move from that point downwards, we are going to lose L divided by the unit labor requirement. It's going to be L 400 divided by 4 is 100 cases of beer. So we were producing 100 cases of beer, and now we've given up that 100 cases of beer in order to produce the 400 pizzas, which is L, the amount of labor, divided by the unit labor requirement. So the slope of the PPF is just the rise over the run. So we have these two numbers here. We can use them. So we have the rise, which is a negative number. We're decreasing the amount of beer and then increasing the amount of pizza. So we have negative L over the unit labor requirement of beer, and that is divided by L divided by L, the labor requirement of pizza. I could rewrite that as the following. So I'm just multiplying by the reciprocal of the denominator here, which is the same thing as dividing by that number. And as you can see here, I have an L in the numerator and the denominator. They will cancel out with one another. And I can write that as the negative, the unit labor requirement for pizza over the unit labor requirement of beer. Realize that this is just the unit labor requirement of whatever items on the x-axis divided by the unit labor requirement of whatever's on the y-axis. So regardless of what we call these particular items. So this is important. Make sure you remember this and understand it, because we are going to use this in particular, that when we start talking about trade, is that we're going to compare this slope of the PPFs to the slope of another country's to make a determination of whether or not trade is possible. So what we did is all we showed was all of these are possible levels of production of beer and pizza for this particular economy. We didn't say what they're actually going to produce. In order to make a determination of what this economy is going to produce, we have to introduce the prices of these two commodities. So I'm going to show you here, we have the ratio of the prices, so we can assume that pizza is equal to $1. So it has a value of $1, sells for $1, and a case of beer sells for $3. Let's take a look at what this means in terms of income. Remember that the only input that we're using, the only factor of production, is labor. There's no capital, so there's no entrepreneurship going on here. People are just producing and trying to maximize their income. So remember, it takes individuals 4 hours to produce a case of beer. So in 4 hours, they're going to make $3. Alternately, in 4 hours, they can make 4 pizzas, and they can sell those pizzas for $1 a piece. So in the 4 hours, they're going to make $4. So realize that people, if they want to maximize their incomes, are going to spend all of their time producing pizza because they're going to achieve a higher income because of the fact that in 4 hours of making a case, they're going to make $3. But in the 4 hours that they spent making pizza, they're going to be making $4. So it's more attractive to make pizza because you have a higher income when you're producing pizza at these prices. So when the price of pizza divided by the price of beer is greater than the unit labor requirement of pizza over the labor requirement of beer, we're going to produce nothing but pizza. So when the price of the good that's on the x-axis divided by the price of the good on the y-axis, that ratio is greater than the ratio of the labor requirements, the unit labor requirements of the two commodities, you produce what is on the x-axis. Let's change this and make the price of beer equal to 5. How does this change our scenario? So remember, the individual can spend 4 hours producing a case of beer, and they'll be compensated $5 for that. Or in that same 4 hours, they can produce 4 pizzas and sell them for $4. Now it's more attractive to produce beer because in 4 hours, people are making $5 when they're making beer versus $4 when they're making pizza. So when the price of pizza divided by the price of beer is less than the unit labor requirement for pizza over the unit labor requirement of beer, you end up producing nothing but beer. So I've given you the two extreme examples when the ratio of the prices is greater than the unit labor requirements, and then when the ratio of the prices is less than the ratio of the unit labor requirements. So the last scenario is they could be equal to one another. And when they're equal to one another, this economy will produce a combination of beer and pizza. And this will all depend on the relative demand, i.e. relative preferences of this particular economy. For example, if people prefer beer and pizza relatively equally, you can expect them to produce relatively spend equal amounts of time producing beer and pizza. Whereas if the individuals in that economy, their preferences start shifting away from beer and over to pizza, you can expect them to start producing more pizza and less beer. So make sure you remember this. This is going to be very important, this notion of what the slope of the PPF is, because one, it helps to determine what the level of production is relative to the prices, but also when I introduce another economy and introduce international trade or the possibilities of international trade to those individuals, the slope of the PPF is going to be very important in that entire process.